Well, thank you so much, Jay-Z, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you, your audience. You are so generous with that welcome. I'm really stunned by what I've witnessed so far. This morning, as Jay-Z said, was a real eye-opener for me, because I thought I had done original research. And I would have sworn that I had a book that actually was the first one to reveal a lot of this information. And then I find out that Ramtha was talking about this back in 1977. So now I'm intrigued. I say, well, I want to watch those lectures. I want to be able to cross-reference, see what he said then and what this other whistleblower said then, and begin the research. But what that opened me up to was, as Jay-Z said, you've been in the trenches. You've been doing this work for nearly 40 years. You've been preparing yourselves, your communities, and society for some incredibly disturbing truths. Information that maybe not for you, because you've been listening to the Ramtha lectures and reading the books for many years now, but for many others in our world of 7 billion, for whom this information is new, and they're going to be thrust into a situation, whether it's next month, 6 months, 6 years, but at some point, they're going to be thrust into a situation where they are going to be confronted with a lot of disturbing truths, and they're going to ask themselves, how could this have happened? How can we prepare for the enormity of the challenges that lie ahead? And it's very fortunate for all of us that Jay-Z, through Ramtha, has set up a school where you've been training yourselves, absorbing the information for decades now, so that when the great unprepared humanity suddenly has all this information thrust upon them, they're going to have a place to turn to. There are going to be many others that are going to offer them solutions, things springing up overnight. But the fact that Ramtha's been doing this since 1977, I think speaks volumes to the integrity of Ramtha and what Jay-Z has been doing. So I want to just say that I'm very honoured to be here and to be able to give you some information that maybe you haven't heard, which is new. Thank you. So I want to begin with this idea of secret space programs, because it's something that for many people who have been studying the extraterrestrial phenomenon is something that they've been trying to unravel, something that they've been trying to understand, given the many different sources that are out there, the many different experiences, whistleblower testimonies, documents, literature. When you begin to study this phenomenon of UFOs, extraterrestrial life, it's so bewildering. There's just so much information. And so people like myself, I do have a scholarly background, so what I try and do is look at all the different sources and try to make sense of them and try and put them into a timeline and find out, well, who was the original source of this idea or that idea? And so that is what I do. But still, when it came to this issue of secret space programs, I really didn't know exactly how to piece it all together. So I needed help. And there were two people that I would say have been really very helpful in piecing together what's going on with the secret space programs and how they connect with extraterrestrial life. So I want to begin with this first person, and before doing that, I'll just point out that my talk's broken up into 4 parts. I'm going to firstly talk about the origin of the secret space programs and of something called the Dark Fleet, where these 2 individuals kind of really helped understand the history of where all this began, where the secret space programs began to take birth and take shape in the 20th century. Then I'm going to talk about the Solar Warden program and other space programs that have been birthed out of that Solar Warden program. Then I'm going to be talking about recent negotiations and meetings discussing how much of this information is going to be released to the world. That this is not something that is going to be kept from the general public for an indefinite period of time, that there are actual negotiations being held at this moment to discuss how much to release, when, to who. So I'll talk a bit about that. Then I'm going to be talking about current events. What is happening right now during this very period when our world is going to go through a pretty remarkable transformation, at least for those that aren't privy to the kind of information you've been getting with the Ramtha group for decades now. But at least for the majority of humanity, there are going to be some pretty big changes. So I'll talk a bit about that and what that all means in terms of secret space programs and extraterrestrial life. So let me begin now with this person that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Just a show of hands, how many people don't know who Corey Goode is? You don't know Corey Goode? Okay. There's a few. And a few on the internet audience. I'll just special welcome to all of you, wherever you are. Thank you for being here. So there's a few that don't know who Corey Goode is. I would say he is probably something similar to the Rosetta Stone. Those that don't know, the Rosetta Stone was discovered in 1799 in Egypt by Napoleon's armies, and basically it had 3 languages on it, 2 forms of ancient Greek and the Egyptian hieroglyphics. And what it did was it helped the scholars of the time understand ancient Egyptian. So that was how they began to understand what the ancient Egyptians were writing about. So the Rosetta Stone was a very important part of the modern studies of Egyptian history and language. So Corey Goode, in a way, is done that with the secret space programs. He is someone who has been deeply involved in these programs from the time he was 6 years old. And he has been revealing his experiences. And now, with me as a scholar, what I look at, what are a person's experiences, what are the documents supporting those experiences, and then I try and put it all together. And Corey's experiences, the information he's shared, really makes it so helpful in understanding what it is that has been happening behind the scenes. So in terms of my association with Corey Goode, I first began to communicate with him back in March of 2015, just under a year ago. And at the time, I was very focused on the issue of extraterrestrial life and the secret government cover-up. So the kind of information Corey had about secret space programs wasn't entirely new. I had come across some of it before, but it was just so detailed and so comprehensive, and it provided a rubric for understanding everything that I'd come up with before, or everything that I was trying to understand before. It was like having a jigsaw puzzle, this massive jigsaw puzzle, and all of a sudden you're being given a plan for resolving that jigsaw puzzle. So Corey did that, and so back in April of 2015, I was doing these email interviews with him. I was just writing to him, asking him a series of questions, then he'd write back with his answers to all my questions, then I'd write articles and kind of get that out there. And that was the genesis for the book that was eventually published in September. Those interviews were what really led to that. Corey's background is fascinating because what makes him different is that he has experienced 20 years twice in his life. So there's a timeline here, and you can see that in this timeline at age 6, he was taken into a MyLab program, a military abduction program, and then trained as a youngster and as a teenager through high school and so forth to become an asset of the secret space programs based on his talents. And what they identified at that young age was that Corey was an empath, that he had a disposition for being an empath. And so they trained him to be psychically more intuitive so that he could empathically discern what was true, what wasn't true in the secret space programs. Because this is an important part of space program operations, as it is part of any military operation, is how do you find out what's true or not? You do military intelligence and you need to have your assets out there doing human intelligence. Well, if you're doing something in space involving various extraterrestrial entities or other space programs out there in space, you need people who can help you decide what is true or not. So that was the set of skills that Corey was trained in. And then, let me go back. Can I go back? Oh, there we go. So here we are. So he's taken at age 16. He's put through a short period that he describes as some kind of physical enhancement because at age 16 he wasn't very tall, and so they decided that he needed to have some kind of physical enhancements done so that he could then be recruited into the secret space programs. Then at age 17, he gets taken to this place on the moon called Lunar Operations Command, which is a base that is used for secret space programs, for people being taken off planet to begin these 20-year tours of duty, doing all sorts of things in space. So Corey was taken to Lunar Operations Command, put through a very quick induction process, signed some papers, and then off he goes. And he begins service in the Solar Warden program in 1987, and I'll talk about that. And then he's reassigned to other secret space programs. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. This is all from the period 1987 right through to 2007. So for 20 years, he's working with a number of secret space programs, doing all sorts of things related to his skill set, intuitive empath. And then he gets put back into his body, or he's sent back in time and age regressed, which sounds incredible. Apparently technology exists to do that. So he gets put back. It's in 1986 again. He's back in a 16-year-old's body. He's been put back in time, age regressed. So he looks 16, but he's got memories of 20 years in the secret space program. And while they, as a matter of procedure, normally wipe the memories, in his case, he retained most of those memories. One of the reasons why he was able to retain those memories, whereas with a lot of other people who put through this similar process and their minds are wiped, is that because he was kind of much more connected to his soul essence, to that infinite expression of the divine that's within, that he was more connected to that, then the memories were not wiped, because the memories were locked into that soul matrix, if you like. So that's why he didn't lose those memories, but he says that basically he kept quiet. Even though he's only 16, he has these memories of being on the secret space program. He had enough presence of mind to know that if he talked about this, that he would have big problems, so he didn't talk about it. So anyway, so we move forward. He lives a normal life, goes through a typical career working in the information technology industry, and then in 2011 he makes contact with a race of extraterrestrials called the Blue Avians, and then in 2014 he does his first interview. It's a video interview on this Project Avalon website, and then 2015 he starts doing interviews. I do a few with him, as I mentioned, and then in July of last year the Cosmic Disclosure series took off, and I think that's something that has really brought Corey's testimony to a very large audience around the world. One of the things that I want to emphasize at this point is that a lot of the information that Corey has shared in his interviews comes from these smart glass pads that he says he had access to during his tour of duty for 20 years, from 1987 to 2007, that he had access to these smart glass pads with basically intelligence briefings on the secret space programs. Now, not everyone in the secret space programs had access to these smart glass pads. He had access because he had a need to know, because his job was to discern truth from falsity. If someone was lying about something that they were involved in or a program that they were involved in, he needed to know the relevant information so that he could get a better intuitive feel for whether or not that person was telling the truth or not. So that's why he had access to this information. He had need to know. So that's very important, because I'm going to be talking about a second person that I think also helps very much in understanding the secret space programs. Now, this person, his name is William Tompkins. He's not someone I wrote about in the book because I simply didn't know about him at the time I wrote the book back in September. This is his book. It's just come out. It came out in December of 2015, selected by extraterrestrials. And basically, it talks about his experiences in which he began to work for the US Navy in debriefing people that were bringing information back from Nazi Germany during the Second World War. Now, Tompkins, he was a gifted individual. At age 17, this is in 1941, he had built these model ships of what the US Navy had in its in the 1930s through to the early 1940s, what the US Navy had built in that period in the run-up to the Second World War in Long Island and in San Diego Harbor. Tompkins was taken to see those ships, and he had a photographic memory, and so he was able to memorize all the details of the ships that he toured with, and he took measurements and all of those things. So when he went home, he built scaled models of these Navy ships. So by 1941, his father had put some of these ships in a department store in Hollywood Boulevard, and someone from US Navy intelligence saw the ships and thought, oh my God, we got spies out here. And so they basically took Tompkins' father into custody and interrogated him for 2 days, saying, you're a spy, and tell us who you're working for. And he said, no, it's just my son. He does toy models of ships. And so basically the father took the intelligence officers to his home, and they saw Tompkins' room where he had all these stacks of diagrams and models that were being built. And now the Navy intelligence guys weren't that upset. They thought, well, you've got a very talented son. We're going to have him come work for us. So that's what happened. They basically recruited Tompkins in 1941 to go work for the US Navy. He's only 17 at the time. So essentially what happened was that after he went through a clearance process, they did some background investigations and so forth, then he began to work for a Navy admiral based out of the Naval Air Station in San Diego Harbor, who was basically running 28 Navy spies out of Nazi Germany. And these 28 Navy spies were bringing back information to the Navy about what the Nazis were doing and what they were doing as far as anti-gravity research. Apparently the Nazis had successfully developed anti-gravity craft, and some of these craft were capable of spaceflight. So the Navy was learning this back in 1941 to 1945, while Tompkins was part of these debriefings of these spies. And Tompkins' job at the time was to listen to the spies, reveal what they had seen, and then Tompkins would draw a design. That was his skill set. He would draw a design and put together a briefing package that he would take to the leading aerospace companies and think tanks on the US West Coast at the time. So these were major corporations such as Douglas Aircraft Corporation at the time, Lockheed, an organization called RAND, Caltech, MIT. All of these major institutions and think tanks were getting these briefing packages brought to them by this young guy from the Navy, William Tompkins, who was basically explaining what it was that the Navy spies were learning in Germany. So this is a document here that basically is what Tompkins has provided to substantiate what he said he was doing. And what makes Tompkins very different to other whistleblowers, many other whistleblowers, especially for those that talk about the secret space programs, is that Tompkins actually has documents going back to 1941 that actually substantiate the things that he says he experienced. So here's a document basically saying that that proves that Tompkins' mission was to disseminate information on behalf of the Navy to leading aerospace companies. So here, this document actually proves that Tompkins was actually at that age, at that young age, taking advanced aerospace technology information to leading aerospace companies on the US West Coast and other places in the US. Here's two passes for the Naval Air Station at San Diego, signed by the admiral in charge, Admiral Rick Obata, that basically confirmed that Tompkins had approval to take out of the Naval Air Station packages. It refers to packages. It says here, for example, that says, with one package. Here it says 3 packages. So in this date, 1943, on that December 24th, that looks like, he was authorized to take 3 packages out of the Naval Air Station in San Diego to somewhere. So this is documentary proof that Tompkins actually was taking intelligence packages out of the Naval Air Station for some other purpose. So this is very important because it substantiates what he says. Now, what he says he was taking out in those packages correlates with what Corey Good says he was reading on the smart glass pads. And both of them talk about the beginning of the secret space programs with a group of people associated with the Vril Society in Germany before the Second World War. And I think what's really fascinating here is that Tompkins in 41 to 45 was getting these Navy intelligence debriefings and then taking them to people who would help build anti-gravity craft. 40 years later, in 1987, Corey Goode, on these smart glass pads in the secret space program that he was involved in, was reading what I think were basically, if not the same, but very similar intelligence briefings talking about the development of secret space programs in Nazi Germany and even before, in this era, just before the Second World War. Well before the Second World War and immediately after the First World War. So here you have Maria Orsic. She was a psychic, a medium. At the time, I think that they referred to people who communicated with those on the other side as spiritualists. So I'm not quite sure if she would kind of fall into the category of being a channeler, as what Jay-Z does with Ramtha. I'm not sure if that's what she was doing with these beings. She was probably doing something much more widely understood as a form of kind of telepathic communications, trans-channeling. And so she was getting information from these beings who claimed to be from other worlds, who were wanting the Germans at the time to learn about life on other planets and learn how to build technologies so that Germany could begin building these and share it with the rest of humanity. That I think the Vril Society that Orsic was involved with, they began with a very positive agenda, and somewhere along the lines it got sidetracked, but I think that's very common with the many organisations that start off with a very positive agenda. But in this case, she had a lot of psychically transmitted information concerning life on other planets. Now, there's a phrase there at the very bottom that comes from the Rig Veda, which says that the fastest of all that flies is the thought. And I thought that's a very important phrase, because what that tells us is that the Vril Society, back at that time, appreciated the power of thought with developing technology. That thought and technology have some association. And this was something that was many German scientists were open to that possibility, as opposed to in the West, because in the West they just won a major war. The First World War was won by the Allies. Britain, France, the US, they'd won the war. Western science was invincible. So the Western science was based on the Enlightenment idea of the separation of church and state, the separation of things based on kind of spiritual principles and things based on material science. So the victory of the Allied powers kind of locked their scientific community into that Enlightenment worldview. Separation of spiritual and the material sciences. But German scientists, they were open to different ways of thinking. And so that's why they began to really make some remarkable progress when it came to developing anti-gravity technologies. For the Vril Society, there's a book written in 1871, I believe it was, by Edward Bulwer Lytton, which describes this subterranean civilization that had this power to use the Vril force, or something that we would call now chi, prana, orgone, many different terms that are used for it, but they were successful to a certain extent in using that force in manipulating technology. That the Vril Society really believed, along with many others that were supporters of Edward Bulwer Lytton's idea, that you could actually master technology using the power of the mind. So this is an idea that Lytton had popularized back in the 19th century, and Orsich and the Vril Society were big supporters of that. And of course, Vril, the force, and I don't think I need to talk much about this to you here. I mean, you do this here. I mean, this is really, you're doing this kind of training right now. I mean, you should tell me about it. But for those that aren't familiar with this, this is something that those who later on that put together these secret space programs noted how important it was to develop some kind of psychic ability to be able to use these advanced technologies. And so I know that this is one of the things that Corey Good has written about, that there are Jedi-like psychic trainings in the secret space programs, and that this is a very real phenomenon in the secret space programs. And I know that it's been mentioned that the CIA has been very interested in what Ramtha has been doing, because they were studying what Ramtha was doing in putting together their programs. So in Germany, this is all pre-Second World War. This is prior to the rise of Adolf Hitler. You had this organization called the Thule Society, and they used the swastika. The swastika is a very ancient symbol. It basically is just denotes energy, and it was a way in which the Vril force was kind of like symbolized. So the swastika was used for that. The Thule Society, that term comes from Hyperborea, which is the civilization that they thought that Maria Orsich and the Vril Society were in contact with. That the capital of Hyperborea was called Ultima Thule, so that's where they got the term the Thule Society, because this was an underground civilization that goes back many thousands of years, many millennia. The swastika, that was actually used by the Nazis, and the Thule Society was the organization that actually sponsored the rise of the National Socialist Party, which became known as the Nazis. So the same party, or the same organization, the Thule Society, that was supporting Maria Orsich and the Vril Society in building or developing the very first anti-gravity craft, they were sponsoring the rise of Adolf Hitler. So it's a kind of very dark chapter that began with the Thule Society. Some of the people, some of the scientists that were involved with the secret space programs later on became of great interest to the United States after the Second World War. One of the people was a professor from the Technical University of Munich, Winifred Schumann, and he was an expert in high voltage electrostatics and rotating energy plasma fields, and I'll kind of talk a little bit more about that soon. But I just wanted to draw your attention to this document. That's a project paperclip document that basically has the name of Professor Schumann on it, that he was one of the scientists that Operation Paperclip recruited and took to the United States after the Second World War to help with the reverse engineering programs that were being studied out of Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio back in 1947 there, 1945 to 47. I won't talk too much about this other than just say that the idea of high voltage electrostatics, it's kind of similar to the way lightning operates. You have a very high voltage lightning, the high potential in the kind of stratosphere, and that lightning is a discharge of tremendous energy because there's a big gap in terms of potential. The voltage gap between the surface of the Earth and the upper atmosphere is so great that you have these lightning discharges. So that's an electrostatic charge. So basically, Thomas Townsend Brown, he was the first person back in 1928 to put together a patent describing how this electrostatic charge could actually provide a thrust to anything. So if you had a high enough electrostatic charge, it could actually move things really quickly. It would give it a thrust forward. And then you had the other principle that Schumann, who was with the Vril Society, was an expert in, which was high-frequency rotating plasma. And basically what that would do was if you rotated plasma, which is kind of like matter reduced to its primary energy state, and in this case, mercury was the form of plasma which would produce the best results. If you rotated that fast enough, really fast around something, then what would happen, very high frequency rotations, like 100,000 rotations or something per minute, you would actually have weight reduction. So that craft or that vehicle, whatever this rotating plasma was going around, would reduce in weight. So with electrostatics, you have something that would give thrust. With high rotating plasma, you would have something that would reduce weight. These were important principles for the development of these spacecraft. And one of the things that Bill Tompkins said that he found with the Navy spies was that the Germans had developed 30 different types of spacecraft, 30 different types of configurations which these principles could be used. So they built small flying saucers, larger flying saucers, bell-shaped, kind of flatter shapes. They used all sorts of different designs. Some were designed to be freighters, some were designed to be fighters. So the Germans were designing all these different types of craft that could be used for these anti-gravity technologies that they were pioneering. And so basically the Navy was learning about this back in 1941 to 45, that the Germans had developed 30 different prototypes. One of them that the Navy had discovered was called the Andromeda device, which, as you can see there, it kind of operates as a kind of aircraft or like a spacecraft carrier. So you have a couple of craft here, one there, and more craft there. It's a cigar-shaped ship. So this was something that was developed by the Germans. And what's interesting about this was that this was a very large ship, a very large cigar-shaped ship. And this used a kind of different type of propulsion to what I've discussed so far. It was based on the principle of teleportation. So this is where we kind of get into this whole idea of very large craft where you could actually put together technologies that would teleport these craft to different places. So, for example, and many of you, I'm sure, are aware of the Philadelphia experiment. You've heard about that. You know about Nikola Tesla. That he was associated with that he was actually a big part of the teleportation research that was being conducted by the US Navy at the time. And it was very similar to what the Germans had discovered, that with very large objects, that it didn't necessarily need to be that you would just try to take it from point A to point B using what I've discussed so far in terms of like some kind of thrust force, or a kind of something that would reduce its weight, that you could actually teleport it to that location. And this is where the whole idea of thought comes in. Like teleportation involves thought to some extent, or consciousness to some extent. So to be able to successfully teleport from point A to point B, you need people at point A who can consciously make a connection with point B, and then that craft could teleport there. And that the craft would actually serve as a way of magnifying or enhancing or focusing the person's consciousness so that they could do that. So that's the kind of technology that was being developed by the Germans, and also the Navy was studying teleportation back in the 40s. But the Germans were successful in developing these technologies. Now, Corey Goode, he talked about the first 6 years of his service in the secret space programs. He was on this ship called the Arnold Sommerfeld, and so that was from 1987 to 1993 that he served on this cigar-shaped ship that was basically doing space patrol in our solar system. And I thought about that, and I thought, well, Sommerfeld, who is Arnold Sommerfeld? I mean, who's Sommerfeld? And so I did some research and found that Arnold Sommerfeld was a German physicist who is most well known for having trained the most Nobel Prize-winning physicists in history. And that one of the things that he had done was that he had worked with Albert Einstein in putting together some kind of anti-telephone technology. So here you have Albert Einstein in his prime conducting a thought experiment. And so Arnold Sommerfeld did this thought experiment with Einstein, and it was called the tachyonic anti-telephone. And it was basically something along the lines, I don't know if I can remember this limerick, it was something like, I can't quite remember it, but basically if you set out on a journey, you would arrive at your destination before you set out. That was the kind of idea here. And so this was a thought experiment that Sommerfeld had come up with Einstein, but that apparently this was successfully developed by the Germans. And later on, there's a whistleblower who hasn't yet gone public, but I've been in touch with him and been talking about him, and he basically has a really interesting story, and he says he served on this freighter for the Dark Fleet, that it was actually run by the Nazis, and this is recently, we're talking in the last 20 years, that he says he served on this Dark Fleet freighter ship, and that it had a base on Ceres, on the asteroid belt, and that this Dark Fleet base on the asteroid belt was a place where the freighter and other ships would go for R&R and kind of like get ready for their various missions throughout the galaxy. And so he says that basically what the captain would do, they would use this anti-telephone technology, which would mean that it was standard operating procedure where before they went out on a mission, they would first wait for them to return from the mission before setting out. Does that make sense? So like the captain would actually have specific orders, or would know that, okay, when the mission has been successful, then you reappear in this location so that at that time of the mission itself, you would see that you appeared at the location so that everything was okay. If the mission was a failure and you didn't show up, then you knew not to go. So this was a great way of being able to kind of use this kind of technology so that you would know which missions would be successful or not. So this was something that apparently the Dark Fleet was using. So the Dark Fleet, what is that? Essentially, the Dark Fleet, this is something that Corey Goode and Tompkins have both said, that the Dark Fleet basically emerged out of agreements that were reached between the reptilian civilization and Adolf Hitler. That they reached agreements, and these agreements were of great help to the Nazi regime especially. Because one of the things, and I point this out in the book, I'll emphasize here, is that really Germany had two space programs. One was a kind of more civilian space program run by the secret societies of Germany, and the second was run by the SS, the Nazi SS, that had world conquest on its mind. But the most advanced technologies were withheld from the Nazi SS, so that eventually, as the war ended, Germany had to relocate all of its assets to other locations at Antarctica and South America. And one of the common questions people ask me is, well, if the Nazis were being helped by reptilians, how come the Allies won the war? Okay, well, there's a few reasons for that, but one of the reasons I'll mention is that guess who the Nordic extraterrestrials were helping? Right, you get it. So, the Nazis basically go to Antarctica, and in 1939 they are directed to Antarctica by their reptilian allies and told to go to 3 locations in Antarctica where they'll find deep underground caverns, and there they can build bases. And so in 1939, that's what happened. This is even before the Second World War began, that the Nazis were already building down there. During the Second World War, the Nazis, or the German secret space programs, out of their Antarctica bases, they were able to move forward in developing their space program to the degree that they were able to achieve successful missions to the moon. Now, at this point, a lot of people are going to ask, how could that be? How could that be? I mean, the Nazis were being pummeled in Germany. I mean, they were operating out of these underground caverns. They were building these massive factories at incredible speed. How could they possibly have launched missions to the moon? Well, the answer to that is, well, they didn't. Not out of Europe anyway. From 1939 right up until 1947, German secret societies and the Nazis had these bases in Antarctica that had not been disturbed. So right throughout the war, while war was being fought out in Europe and Asia, the Far East, in Antarctica, nothing was happening, or there were no real military hostilities. The Germans were moving ahead with their programs. And so they achieved things that now we think would be kind of science fiction, but according to these whistleblowers, Corey Good, Tompkins, they had achieved remarkable success, such as manned missions to the moon. So sometime in the 40s, they developed missions to the moon. In the 1940s, the Germans had established colonies on Mars, which again is incredible to think of, that they had done this. But this is part of our history. And this is part of what I think is very important for us to appreciate, that as this information comes out, what's becoming clearer and clearer is that we are not an insular planetary civilization. We have become, because of these achievements by governments and military organizations and secret societies, a galactic society without knowing it, without being aware of it. We've become that. And as we are presented with this information that secret bases have been built on Mars and in other parts of our solar system and in other parts of the galaxy, what we realize is that we are a galactic culture. We truly are. But this is information that is restricted to a very small cadre of people. And I think this is what is very relevant to what you do here with the Ramtha School of Enlightenment. Your dictum is, know thyself. Know thyself. We are also part of a collective. We are part of a civilization on this planet, or we are part of a nation state. So that is also a part of who we are. So when we're denied this information, then we are denied knowing who we are, which is why I think it's so remarkable that this information has been presented since 1977 by Ramtha and Jay-Z. I think that's incredible because, and I think even in the lecture before, or in the film before this, early this morning, Ramtha said, knowing about alien civilizations will help you know about yourselves. So I think it's the same principle here. Knowing about these secret space programs and what they've been doing will help us know about ourselves. Thank you. So colonies on Mars in the 40s. So I'm going kind of through this chronologically because that helps me better understand how this all comes together and hopefully presents it to you in a coherent framework so that you can better appreciate how all of these pieces of the puzzle come together. So 1946-47, you have Operation High Jump. I believe many of you probably know about this. A fleet, an armada of Navy ships go to Antarctica, and they have kind of like, the public mission is just kind of science and exploration, but they have this aircraft carrier, and there you see the USS Philippine Sea fully loaded, what it was capable of. It was really a mission to find, take control, or destroy the Nazi bases in Antarctica. This was kind of finishing off the business of the Second World War. That the Navy was now ready. 46-47 was, the war ended in August 1945. So by the time the Navy had found out exactly what was going on, it took them a while, but then they put together this armada for the next available season, which was the summer months of Antarctica, which was November, December 1946 and January, February of 1947. So they go there, and the Operation High Jump is met by these fleets of UFOs flying out of the ocean. And William Tompkins had some really important details about that. He basically said that there were two waves of UFOs, that there were approximately 30 UFOs, the Germans, UFOs and their allies, that basically destroyed all of the aircraft that Operation High Jump had, sank several of the destroyers and a number of the smaller support craft, and then just basically turned away and just let the rest of Operation High Jump return back to the US. They had no intention of destroying the naval armada because they thought that, well, if they did that, then that would kind of like just lead to the Navy trying again. But this way they would send a message to the Navy that, don't come, you're not invited here. So that was a very powerful message. Then shortly afterwards you have these big craft appearing over major cities in the United States. Now, of course, people are well aware of the UFO wave in 1947, beginning 1940s and 1950s. And I myself and many others always assumed that these were extraterrestrial craft. But what we're told by Corey Good and William Tompkins is that no, these were not extraterrestrial craft, that these were Nazi craft. That the Germans were actually using these craft to intimidate the US government, the Truman government, the Eisenhower government, into negotiating so that they would actually strike deals that would allow the Germans to infiltrate the US military-industrial complex. Of course, the Nazi UFO flyover of Washington, D.C., 1952, I've always thought beforehand that this was something that was associated with a group called the Ashtar Command. George Van Tassel talked about this, and for a long time I was convinced of that. This was something that, as I said, Good and Tompkins and another whistleblower, Clark McClelland, who worked for NASA as a contractor for 34 years, that he also said that these were Nazi UFOs that flew over the Washington Capitol. So now I've kind of like had to shift my position and now think that, okay, it's very likely that these were indeed Nazis basically putting pressure on the US government. So this was the old, the carrot and the stick approach. So far the Nazis have provided the stick. Okay, they beat Operation High Jump. They fly over American cities. And now they basically are setting out to force the Truman and the Eisenhower administration into reaching agreements with the Nazi breakaway civilization that's based in Antarctica and South America. Now, there's a very important document that I've recently come across. It's called the Red House Report. Basically what happened was that in August of 1944, after the Normandy invasion, after the Allies swept into France, that Martin Bormann, who was the deputy Führer, he was basically the man that ran Nazi Germany. Hitler was the leader, but Bormann was the one who actually handled a lot of the kind of details of managing Germany. He brought together the leading German industries, 12 of them, in this city in France, Strasbourg, in Alsace-Lorraine, and basically told them that the war's lost. What you're ordered to do now is move all of your capital, all of your liquid capital, everything that you can, out of Germany, move it into neutral nations, move it into invest in corporations that will allow Nazi Germany to rise again as an economic power. So that the Germans, even before the surrender, were already divvying up their resources around the world in all of these allied or all these neutral countries or friendly countries, or in corporations that previously were friendly to the Nazi powers. And that's a US military intelligence report actually describing this meeting in Strasbourg, Germany, saying that Bormann gave the orders for German capital to flee Nazi Germany before the end of the war. So this is where you get the carrot. So, the carrot and the stick. How do you subvert the US military-industrial complex? You got the stick, your fleets of anti-gravity craft. Now you've got the carrot, all of these enormous German funds that have been invested in places like Switzerland, Spain, Luxembourg, South America, that can now pour into the US military-industrial complex and basically fund these or bring in extra capital so that they could expand their operations. And so that was the kind of carrot and the stick. Jim Marrs came out with a book several years ago that discusses this particular idea of the US actually being taken over by this influx of Nazi German capital. Marrs didn't talk about the Nazi fleets in Antarctica because he wasn't aware of that at the time, but this certainly does talk about the economic power. Here we have some disturbing information that Corey Goode has given, that the Germans nuked Mars and actually built slave colonies with US corporations. Then in the 1950s, and Corey's talked about this in the Cosmic Disclosure episodes. How many people have watched the Cosmic Disclosure episodes with Corey Goode talking about the Mars being nuked? How many of you watched that? Oh, okay. Not that many, just about a quarter. Basically, what he described was that when the Germans started to build their bases on Mars, the equatorial region of Mars, because you had these very violent dust storms, all electromagnetic equipment would go haywire. So they had to go north of the 20th parallel, or south of the 20th parallel. This was optimum because the dust storms weren't as powerful, so that meant that the electronics that they built there, or that they had assembled there, wouldn't be damaged by these dust storms on the surface of Mars. The problem was that in those regions, north and south of the 20th parallel, that you actually had indigenous Martian civilizations, reptilians and insectoids. And because the Germans had suffered so many losses in previous hostilities with these groups, that they enlisted the support of the US military-industrial complex, which by now was on board after the agreements were signed and the German capital came in. Now the US military-industrial complex is working side by side with the Nazis and the Germans in the 1950s. Jim Mars talks about that in his book, but certainly this is something that's a very sad chapter in US history, because what happened was that the US military-industrial complex gave the Germans the means and the resources and the manpower and the women power to basically clean out or destroy the indigenous Martians in certain locations, and then build bases there, bases that would eventually become large colonies. So while the first use of nuclear weapons was in 1945, as far as we know, in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, not long after that, nuclear weapons were used in all places, Mars, by the German secret space programs with their allies in the US military-industrial complex. And so down there you have, this is an article that's on my website that you can find, and here you have leading organizations that are part of the military-industrial complex. Part of this is associated with the history of the Dark Fleet, that as the military-industrial complex becomes involved, the Dark Fleet now emerges. Its genesis was in Nazi Germany, but of course the Nazis didn't have the manpower or the resources to really build a vast armada of ships that would be part of a Dark Fleet. With the US military-industrial complex, the Nazis were able to do that, and so that led to the genesis, or that led to the emergence of the Dark Fleet. And this is something that operates throughout the galaxy, that we are part of an imperial space culture. I mean, this is a very sad possibility, fact, if you like, if you accept the data. This is being done, and we are part of that. Of course, we can always claim ignorance, and it's true. We don't know about it, not up until recently. But as this information becomes more widespread, it's like the organizations and the people that established these fleets or these colonies or these operations grew out of Europe, grew out of the United States. And so there is a responsibility there to kind of like bring that under some kind of control. So that's the development of the Dark Fleet, which is kind of like, as I was saying, a very sad chapter in the history of our galactic civilization. I think we need to start calling ourselves a galactic civilization. While we're not conscious of it all, that is who we are. You know, if at an unconscious level, if we're doing things, we need to take responsibility at some level consciously for that, or at least take steps to rectify that. So thank you. So now we get to the next secret space program, and that is the Solar Warden program. And this is where I bring Bill Tompkins back into the picture, because now he begins to work with the Navy in aerospace companies. As I mentioned earlier, from 1941 to 1945, he's working for US Navy intelligence. After the war, he then begins to work with the aerospace industries, aerospace corporations, and he ends up working at the Douglas Aviation Company, which has a think tank that's called Advanced Design. And he ends up working at this think tank from 1951 to 1963. Now, this was one of the same think tanks that he was taking these debriefing packages about what the Nazis had developed in Germany during the war. So now, it's after the war, now he's working with Douglas and he's helping the Navy put together plans for a fleet of spacecraft. And he comes up with designs for this. Now, this is where it's very important to kind of like understand how the Navy operates as opposed to an institution like the Air Force. Okay, so the way the Navy operates in kind of thinking, you know, force projection, as opposed to, say, the Air Force. The Air Force might think in force projection in terms of like, okay, aircraft. We want to be able to build aircraft and have as many aircraft in a certain place so that we can project ourselves over there to achieve our missions. So you want to build aircraft, as many aircraft as you can. That's the way the Air Force operates. So they contract out to major aerospace companies, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, and so forth, and tell them, you know, build these aircraft, and we need them for our pilots. The Navy operates in a very different paradigm. They operate in terms of battle formations. They don't think in terms of one ship. They think in terms of a collection of ships. They think in terms of like an aircraft carrier and a couple of cruisers, and then you have destroyers, and then you have torpedo ships, and then you have support craft. So they think in terms of battle groups. So, and of course, you've got the Navy with its fleets all around the world, these battle fleets that are focused on these aircraft carriers. Well, when it comes to space, the Navy sees space as this huge ocean. So they're not thinking in terms of putting one ship out there, you know, one big ship. They're thinking of putting out battle groups. And they're not thinking of, you know, just putting out one ship out there and then we'll add another one later and another one later. They're thinking of, okay, you know, we put out our battle groups at the same time because that's the way they operate. So it's going to take them a long time to put together battle groups of spacecraft that can project this kind of power into outer space as part of a secret space fleet that's under the control of the Navy. Well, that's where Bill Tompkins came in. His job was to design these battle fleets. So he would think about what would be needed in terms of achieving the Navy's goals. And one of the things I'll talk about is the NOVA program, and I'll talk about that a little bit pretty shortly. But essentially, the Navy had a plan to project its power incrementally. First, it would go to the moon. Then it would project itself to Mars and other planets. And then it would go to the surrounding solar systems, Alpha Centauri and Beta Centauri, 12 solar systems surrounding the Earth, or surrounding our solar system, and basically establish a presence with these space Navy battle fleets. That was the plan. So they told Tompkins, that's what we want to do. So Tompkins said, okay, so that's your mission, this is what you need. And so that's what he helped the Navy to do, he would design these naval battle fleets. And that was back in 1951 right through to 1963. So that was what he was doing. That was his work for 12 years. And I can answer questions later about the details of how the Navy operated. But essentially, that was his main job. Tompkins says that while he was there, and that's a picture of him working at the time. Now he's working at Douglas Aircraft Company, and he displays the model ships that he became first known for back in 1941. And what was interesting, he said that while he was working at Douglas, he was being helped by 2 secretaries. And this is very interesting because when he got a copy of my book, Insiders Reveal Secret Space Programs, he said he got a shock when he saw this picture of Maria Orsic. He said, that was my secretary. He looked at that and he said, that was my secretary. Fancy that. Now, I don't think it was Maria Orsic, but what it tells you is that Maria Orsic, her genetics and the genetics of this person were very close. They were related or came from the same family. But basically what Tompkins was saying was that his secretary was from a Nordic civilization, a Nordic extraterrestrial civilization that were helping the Navy develop these fleets of space battleships. It's like, wow, isn't that amazing? Why would Nordic extraterrestrials help the Navy develop space battle fleets? Well, you've all watched Star Wars. There's the dark side and the light side, or the conflicting sides. Well, basically, what Tompkins was told by the Nordics was that we need your help in fighting the reptilians. The reptilians have imperial presence throughout the galaxy and they're threatening us. We want your help in dealing with them. This is not just our problem. It's your problem as well. You need to help us. And the Navy was acknowledging, yeah, this is our problem too, because we know what happened with the Nazis and their dark fleet, and we don't control the dark fleet. The Navy was very well aware, because they had basically went to Antarctica to remove the Nazis, and they got pummeled. And so they realized that this was not a force that was acting for the good of the planet. And so Tompkins was basically working at Douglas to help the Navy design these space fleets. And of course, that's a picture of Commander Ashtar and the Ashtar Command. I wasn't told that was the name of the Nordic extraterrestrial battle fleets leader, but certainly the Nordics did have their own battle fleets that were engaged in this kind of galactic conflicts, and that the Navy was being helped so that they could eventually join in or help or take sides in that. So this is one of the designs that Tompkins had put together. It's a battle cruiser. It's he said that these things could be like over 1 kilometre long, up to 2 kilometres long, space battle cruisers. And that these were being developed later on. It's not in his book, but later on he says that these were being developed in the Wasatch Mountains of Utah. They have very large construction facilities there, and these were where they were first manufactured back in the 70s and 80s, but I'll get to that. Here's the large cigar-shaped ships. These would be the kind of like space carriers. That would carry the smaller spacecraft, so kind of like just a space version of an aircraft carrier. Again, over 2 kilometres long. So these would be part of the space battle fleets that Tompkins was putting together, helping the Navy design back in the 1950s. So what happens is that the Navy and Tompkins and what's happening at Douglas goes through a really interesting phase, because essentially the Navy is aware that the most advanced technologies are anti-gravity technologies. But while Tompkins was working at Douglas Aircraft Corporation, that the development of these anti-gravity technologies were not being allowed, or that they were being kind of slowed down, prevented from higher powers within the corporation. And basically what the Douglas Corporation and all the other leading aerospace companies in the United States at the time were being encouraged to go down the track of building rocket propulsion systems. That this was what they were being encouraged to do. And so basically what you had was that all of the major aerospace companies in the United States were putting the majority of their resources into building rockets for the Apollo missions. And the development of anti-gravity technologies were being kind of like slowed down, sabotaged. Tompkins said basically what would happen to him every time they got to a point where things could really move forward, he'd be sacked from that company and he'd have to go to another company. And he said what was happening was that it was sabotage, that the reptilians, through their infiltration of the military-industrial complex, were basically preventing anti-gravity technology being developed in any quick way by any US aerospace industry. And basically all energy was going into rocket propulsion. So nevertheless, the Navy was behind the Apollo missions. This is something Tompkins has talked about, but there was a lot of sabotage happening, and it was related to the reptilians. Some of the people in the Apollo program are celebrated as kind of like being leading lights in the development of rocket technologies, which took us to the moon. And if you accept the paradigm that yes, there's no secret space program, then you can look at the Apollo moon missions as a kind of success, and that these guys like Kurt Debus, who was the first director of the Kennedy Space Center, 1963, that was actually, 61 I believe, 61. He was a former Nazi, an ardent Nazi, and how did this man become the first director of NASA's Kennedy Space Center? How could that have happened? I think it was part of an effort to basically steer the US military-industrial complex to developing rocket technologies. And that this was something that the Nazi SS was still involved in. And this man, Hans Kammler, was seen by Clark McClelland in the mid-1960s in Kennedy Space Center in Florida, having a discussion with Kurt Debus. And so Kammler was the guy that was in charge of the SS Special Projects Division. So what's he doing having a conversation, or what's he doing alive and in the United States, and having a conversation with the director of the Kennedy Space Center in the mid-1960s? It was kind of like to keep the US firmly on track of developing rocket technologies and not going down the path of anti-gravity. And here's one of the other documents that Tompkins has supplied, basically proving that he was at the Kennedy Space Center, that he was part of a special project that Kurt DeBoos had put together. And DeBoos really appreciated Tompkins because these former Nazis really like intelligent people. They just find them to be, they find something that they like in terms of their knowledge of some abstract or some kind of very esoteric discipline. So Tompkins had a kind of profound knowledge of aircraft design and spacecraft design, and DeBoos appreciated that and gave him an important role in the development of the Kennedy Space Center launch facility and the Saturn IV rocket, one of the launching things. And this is a document proving that actually Tompkins was actually on the design committee for the Kennedy Space Center. So we're talking about a really very well-credentialed, high-placed whistleblower here. This is not an unqualified person. Tompkins really is a very important whistleblower coming forward. And here he is, he came up with the NOVA design. And I mentioned earlier that the Navy had a plan. They had a plan, and it was the same plan replicated in the NOVA program. The NOVA was, basically the Apollo program had 4 stages. We only ever saw stage 1, which was the Apollo moon landings, where we saw the Apollo rockets land on the moon, collect some rocks, look around, do the tourist thing, I was here type thing, plant the flag and all of that, and then come back smiling. But that was only the first stage. Stage 2 was to put 10,000 Navy people on the moon. They were going to build 5 Navy bases around the moon, 2,000 personnel in each of these bases. Stage 3 was to place bases on Mars and other planets in the solar system. That was the third stage. And stage 4 was to place bases in 12 adjoining star systems. This was the Navy's plan. This was strategic. This was how you defend the Earth from imperial space powers. You develop a concentric ring of 12 bases around our solar system with the Navy's projected space assets. That was the plan. And the Navy was building space battlecraft secretly, but it was taking a long time. Work began in the 50s, and it would only be consummated a little bit later, and I'll mention that soon. And in the interim, you would use these rockets, but you weren't going to use the Saturn V rocket. That wasn't going to be enough. You can see the payload here of the Saturn V was 47,000 pounds, I believe. 47,000 pounds. And here the NOVA, this was what Tompkins said that they were designing, because you're going to put 10,000 Navy people on the moon. You're not going to be able to use these Saturn V rockets. What the Navy had in mind were these NOVA rockets. This was stage 2 of the Apollo mission, of the Apollo program. The Apollo was a Navy mission all along. It was never meant to be a civilian program. That was just a disguise. It was a Navy program. The next stage was NOVA 1, and look at the payload, 455,000 pounds. So 10 times the payload of the Saturn V. So that was what the Navy had in mind, that they were going to put 10,000 people on the moon and then use these huge rockets as an interim measure while they were preparing their anti-gravity space battleships. So that was the plan. So what happened? What went wrong? In 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were greeted at the moon. They were greeted. There was a reception committee, and this was the reception committee, as you can see. It was like looking at them. And these were like big spacecraft, very big, kilometre-long spacecraft. That's the Sea of Tranquility. Tompkins, ironic, isn't it? The Sea of Tranquility, okay. Sea of Tranquility, and this is Aldrin and Armstrong. This is what they see up there. Now, William Tompkins was actually at the Kennedy Space Center when this was televised. There was actually a live video feed, and he saw this at the Kennedy Space Center. And as I showed you before, Tompkins had documents proving that he helped design the Space Center. So he was there for the Apollo mission landing. At the time, he was working for TRW, which was the major aerospace company responsible for the second stage of the Saturn V rocket. So he was there, and he saw this. And of course, many of you have probably heard of the famous radio intercepts, that there were the 2 minutes missing of the Apollo 11 landing, and you probably read the transcripts of, my God, they're huge craft on the edge of the crater looking at us, they're menacing us. You probably all heard that. Well, Tompkins, to my mind, as far as I recall, is the first one that actually saw the video. He saw the video of this, and that was it. So basically, they were told, come and collect your rocks, take your pictures, and go home. So that was what happened. They took their pictures and went home. And since 1971, they haven't been back. That's interesting, isn't it? Okay, so that was warned off the moon. So now Mars. What's happening now? Well, with Mars, they're not quite able to develop space battle fleets yet. They're not ready. So what they use instead is teleportation technology. They're able to use teleportation to transport people to Mars. And so one of the people, the first one to actually come forward to talk about this is a gentleman by the name of Michael Ralph. How many people have heard of Michael Ralph? Oh, okay, only a few. Okay, fair enough. Would be fair to say that he's probably the first person to come forward to talk about doing a 20-year tour of duty with the secret space program. His book came out in 2001. The year 2000. His book came out. It's called The Mars Record. And he talks about the 20 years he spent on Mars. And it's a 20-year tour of duty. And his timeline goes something like this. 1976, he joins the Navy. He's recruited for a top-secret compartmentalized program to go to Mars. So he goes to Mars, and they use teleportation technology. He doesn't fly there. They don't yet have the anti-gravity craft to do that, or at least it's not something that they have easy access to. But apparently they had teleportation technology. The real powers on Mars at the time was the Dark Fleet, the Germans. They were the real power, and they allowed the US military-industrial complex or the US Navy to kind of like work side by side, but only would allow them to use kind of more limited technologies. So you've probably heard stories about rocket ships in the 1960s being sent to Mars. I don't doubt that probably did happen. Alternative 3, maybe some of you have seen that video of this kind of rocket that lands on Mars around 1964. Yes, certainly. At the time, that was what the Navy and the US military had access to or were allowed to use to travel. But teleportation, they were allowed to use teleportation. So anyway, Ralph goes to Mars in 76. He spends 20 years there on Mars, and then basically does kind of fighter pilot duties, psychic warfare. He's also trained, his training was as a psychic assassin, and probably worth going into details here with this audience, because I think you're very familiar with the development of psychic abilities, that he went through various steps of psychic abilities being developed in him. And it began with remote viewing, then it began with remote influencing, and then it eventually resulted in him becoming a psychic assassin, and he described what he was doing, and it's very interesting, and I discuss it a little bit in the book, so there's kind of more details there, but certainly that was what he was doing in 76 on Mars, and he was part of this colony that had been set up there that was kind of working with the Dark Fleet and with the Germans at the time. That was kind of like being increasingly turned over to the US military-industrial complex. Jump room to Mars. Well, I think many of you have heard Andy Basiago. I believe he's been here, right? He's given a talk here, right? So he says in 1980 to 1984 that he was involved in this program, Jump Room to Mars. So again, the same thing. It's like, why wasn't Andy going over to Mars on, say, anti-gravity space vehicles? Because at the time, that wasn't available to the secret space programs, or at least to the US military. Teleportation was the way in which travel between Mars and the Earth was occurring back at that time. Then in 1984, this is when Solar Warden begins operations. The Navy has finally built its first operational space fleet. Sure, they built kind of smaller craft along the way, kind of to test prototypes and so forth, to do all sorts of things. The design began in the 50s and the 60s, construction began in the 70s, and they were operationalized in 1984. So this is when Solar Warden begins operations. Now there are 8 space battle groups that are built by the Navy. 2 become operational in 1984, and another 6 are built over the next decade. And according to Tompkins, this is the way in which the Navy operates, that you have a rotation pattern. You have 4 on, 4 off. Kind of 4 are out there deployed, doing their missions, and another 4 are being kind of repaired or upgraded, being refitted and so forth. That this is the way in which the Navy deals with its battle groups, naval battle groups in the oceans, and it's the same way in which they deal with their space battle groups. So they have 8 at the time. And interestingly, Tompkins is still with the Navy. He's 92 years old. He's 92. He's still with them. He says basically they use him as a consultant now, kind of like a wise man, not a wise guy like a lot of us here, but he's a wise man. And so Tompkins says that the Navy is still working on their policies for Solar Warden, even now. I can talk more about it, but I guess I have to get clearance from him that I can talk about these things. But anyway, I mentioned earlier that Tompkins, while he was at Douglas, was working with an ET, a Nordic extraterrestrial. He's working at TRW also with another one similar to Maria Orsic. So that's the Solar Warden program. Now in the 1980s, soon after Solar Warden becomes operational, you have another space program become operational. And I'll talk about this in the book, so maybe I'll kind of move through it quickly. These are all the programs, or these are some of the corporations that are involved in the aerospace industry. But I thought this one was very interesting. Look at their logo. since 1989, moving things through space and time. Since 1989, AGI. So they're a leading aerospace contractor, and they help the aerospace industry put together technologies for their covert programs, these compartmentalized programs. And so here you have, I think, a kind of a nice illustration of just how long they've been operational. So you can think, okay, 1984, the Navy finally deploys its space fleets, Solar Warden. 1989, you have the Interplanetary Corporate Conglomerate, which is basically a space program run by the same corporations that built the spacecraft for the Navy. Because the military-industrial complex is a web of interlinking corporations and military organizations that are bidding for contracts, that are awarding contracts, that have networks, that distribute classified information. And so it's a web in terms of information flow, in terms of financial flow. But the end result is you have ships being built, spacecraft being built by corporations, Airbus, BAE, Boeing, Northrop Grumman. All of these corporations are involved in building spacecraft, secret spacecraft, for the secret space program and also for the Dark Fleet. And what is also emerging as a separate space program that is run not by the Navy, but is run by Majestic 12. In the book I talk about the Majestic 12 group, which is the group that was set up in 1947 to manage extraterrestrial-related projects. And so they realized that the Kennedy assassination was basically the last gasp of the American Republic. After President Kennedy was killed, I think we can really say that the United States became the Fourth Reich, or an aspect of the Fourth Reich. Very unfortunate, but basically the Majestic 12 launched a coup. And there's a whole history about the conflict between Majestic 12 and American presidents, but Kennedy was the last one to really threaten Majestic 12. And so they took him out. And so Majestic 12 realized that they would want to have their own fleet, because in the long term, the Navy was not going to be a very stable ally, because the Navy was comprised of an officer corps that ultimately took their oath to the Constitution seriously, that every Navy officer swears an oath to the Constitution. And it's actually a very good thing that they do, because really they are the ones that are protecting what remains and helping restore the American Republic. Because the American Republic really, in a way, as I said, died in 1963 with President Kennedy in Dallas. And I think the Navy is trying to restore the American Republic, and it's going to be through disclosure that the American Republic is restored. So anyway, so basically, Majestic 12, the corporations it works with, the CIA, there are white hats in the CIA. I think there are white hats in the CIA that are working with Andy Bashagel. I've accepted that that is what's happening there with Andy. But there are also people in the CIA that are working with the black hats. They're the ones that were involved with the Kennedy assassination. They're the ones that are involved with the Dark Fleet and with Majestic 12 and with this group, the Interplanetary Corporate Conglomerate. 1987, Randy Kramer, he is also a secret space program whistleblower. He goes to Mars, but this time he goes there on a spacecraft. He goes there on one of the spacecraft that belongs to the Solar Warden program, because in 1987, Solar Warden is now operational, and they actually have craft that are flying out of the moon base, Lunar Operations Command. So Kramer ends up on Mars for 17 years, and his job was an interesting one. He was kind of part of a mercenary group comprising military Marines whose job was to protect these 5 civilian colonies on Mars. And he described the way in which military personnel were trained and then recruited into these space programs, but that when they served in the field, that the people that were in charge of the overall group, the military group, were not who you would think, the normal military chain, but would be these corporate officials associated with the Mars Colony Corporation. So Kramer was basically affirming that Mars, back in 1987, was run by a civilian enterprise called the Mars Colony Corporation, which is part of the interplanetary corporate conglomerate, using the language that Corey Goode has provided. So Kramer was the first person to talk about Lunar Operations Command, and that was in 2015, April of 2014. April 2014 was when we did a series of interviews on Exo News TV with Randy Kramer, and that's when he began to talk about Lunar Operations Command and his time on Mars. So he was the first to talk about that, and then later Corey Goode confirmed Lunar Operations Command existed. So here again you have the timeline for Randy Kramer, which is very interesting, that 1987 he gets recruited into the Mars, what he calls the Mars Defense Force, and goes to the moon, Lunar Operations Center. This is the same year that Corey Goode says that he was taken there, 1987. So at that time, both Corey Goode and Randy Kramer were 17 years old. So I thought that was just interesting, that they were both taken up at the same time to the moon, and then taken by spacecraft, anti-gravity spacecraft, and very quickly, to their respective places. For Corey Goode, it was to serve on this cigar-shaped spacecraft, and for Randy Kramer, it was to serve for 17 years on Mars. So he serves on Mars for 17 years. Then he says in 2004, he began service for like 2.5 years on one of the cigar-shaped ships. And then 2007, he finishes, which is the same year that Corey Goode finishes, and they both get age regressed and sent back in time to that earlier age. And Randy says it took him a long time to remember his memories, but he eventually got them back. 2006, he first gets interviewed as using a pseudonym, Jed. Then 2007, he begins recalling his memories of being on Mars. And 2014, the first interviews as Captain K. So the interplanetary corporate conglomerate, this was discussed on the Cosmic Disclosure series. Corey described that the colonies on Mars have become so sophisticated technologically that they are now building technologies that are highly sought after throughout the galaxy. Again, we are a galactic culture. We are a galactic civilization. An outgrowth of our Earth civilization is actively trading on Mars and other planets or other bodies in the solar system with up to 900 extraterrestrial civilizations. That's incredible. I mean, that's amazing when you think about it. 900. Why would extraterrestrial civilizations want to trade with us? I mean, isn't this all new for us? Aren't we the kind of new kids on the block? Yes, and no. Yes, we're the new kids on the block, technologically, but in terms of our genetics, we're a very old race. We are kind of a potpourri of many different races. And 22 seems to be the magic number. Not sure why. 22 races. That seems to be the figure that I find most credible from different people. Over the evolution of human history, 22 different extraterrestrial races have tinkered with us genetically, changed our DNA. Why they did it? Are there many different explanations? The one I kind of find most plausible is that somehow, in order for extraterrestrials to incarnate in the human vehicle, the human skin suit, our DNA needs to be compatible with their DNA. Doesn't mean it has to be identical, it just needs to be compatible. So there needs to be some genetic tinkering. We have to have enough of Nordic DNA in our genetics so that Nordic extraterrestrials can incarnate amongst us. Similarly, for extraterrestrials from other star systems, whether it's Lyra or Andromeda or Arcturus or the blue beings or whatever it is, just like there needs to be some compatibility between human DNA and their DNA. So this is very interesting because it means that while, in a way, technologically we're very young, our DNA not only has the potential knowledge of human civilization going back who knows how far, but also has the knowledge of the 22 different extraterrestrial civilizations that are part of our DNA heritage. So potentially, we have within us the ability to master technologies that come from all over the galaxy. So maybe that's why we have this disposition to very quickly, in a short period of time, not only master advanced technologies provided by extraterrestrials, but do it so well and then modify or reform it in ways that the extraterrestrials now say, oh, we want that. You know what you've just done, that's really great. Can we have that? And so there you have trade. Now, unfortunately, the entities or the colonies on Mars and on the asteroid belt and other places in our solar system and even adjoining solar systems where the interplanetary corporate conglomerate and other space programs have a presence, these are not conducted in a way that we would think to be kind of really, honourable or decent in any way. I mean, they're really kind of slave colonies in some way. And the use of slave labour is a big problem, something that Corey Goode has identified. And also, it was very interesting when Randy Kramer, when I was doing my interviews with him, I said, well, what was going on in the Mars Colony Corporation? He said, funny thing is, they never let us in there. He said that the way in which the Mars military bases were run was similar to a military base anywhere, kind of run along the lines of a military base. But he said they were never allowed to go in the civilian bases, which was very strange, very, very interesting. But I think what that was suggesting was that the way in which these civilian bases were being conducted in Mars was atrocious. They were really slave labour camps. And Corey Goode wrote a report about this. I describe it in the book at length, but essentially those that want to expose the secret space programs and the excesses in there were given a tour of a Mars facility where this was happening, and they found that to be true, that indeed there was slave labour being used on Mars. Now, what makes this kind of very interesting was that at the same time as Corey Good was coming out with this information back in June of 2015, was that in Britain, in London, you had an organisation called the British Interplanetary Society that had organised a symposium where they actually had 30 people from various sectors of British aerospace industry, think tanks, military and so forth, all meeting to discuss a hypothetical scenario, which was, and the hypothetical was, how to overthrow a Mars colony dictator. It's like, well, you know, if you look at that, operating with the kind of CNN mindset, it's like, why in the world would anyone do that? What a waste of money. They were doing that because they're getting ready for what's to come, which is that this information is going to come out, is coming out. It's actually come out. It's just a question of how quickly it now spreads out and becomes accepted, and the CNN kind of mindset jumps from Donald Trump's latest insult to, you know, what's really going on Mars? You know, it's like, well. So it's like, this is part of the shift that has to happen if we go from that kind of really superficial mindset on what is happening with these kind of very banal political issues being discussed, when you have these really profound questions of, like, you know, slave labour being used on Mars and atomic weapons being used to wipe out the indigenous life form. I mean, and the US being involved in some way, and corporations kind of supporting all of this. These are all profound issues, and they're not being discussed by CNN or Fox and all of that. And it's like, well, why not? They're waiting for us to tell them to do it. You know, it's like when public opinion shifts and says that this is real, then they're going to give it coverage. And, you know, I'm preaching to the choir. You know that this is real. So it's really all about how quickly others get the message and going to get on board. But I think we can be very confident that when you have signs like this, that British elite organisations, and it's very interesting that the guy that wrote an article for the BBC News said that this meeting in London that hosted this symposium took place a stone's throw from MI6. You know, that's kind of code for MI6 wants this to come out, because the BBC is the mouthpiece for the British intelligence service. So it's like the British want this to come out. And it's funny, you know, the most progressive stories about what's going on really come out through the British tabloids. The British tabloids actually ran a story about Randy Kramer's testimony about, I was on Mars for 17 years. How many people knew that the British tabloids ran a story about Randy Kramer being on Mars? Yeah, they did. It's like, so the British tabloids are actually putting this stuff out. I mean, they're doing it in a way where people can still laugh it off. But the British are getting people ready who pay attention. And so these guys, for the British Interplanetary Society, are getting ready. One of the things that wasn't in the book, but which confirms the information in the book, was the testimony of a Disclosure Project witness by the name of Bill Porlek. And he gave deathbed testimony. He basically said, only released this. There was a video, and he told Stephen Greer to release this only after he died. And so after he died, the video was released, and he talked about an incident back in the 1970s and 80s involving the Siemens Corporation. I forget the exact date, but basically it was sometime in that period, and basically for a 1-year period, what the Siemens Corporation did was that it got one of its subsidiaries in Silicon Valley to set up an assembly plant, and over a 12-month period, they built these RFID chips, very small tracking chips, and they built billions of these tracking chips. Then, after they had built billions of these tiny RFID tracking chips, that facility was dismantled and everything was sold off, and it just vanished. And Bill Pawlak basically said that they had no idea where those billions of RFID tracking chips went. Well, if you have an active slave trade, if you are trading humans with galactic civilizations, and human genetics are valuable because we have 22 different star seeds in our DNA, we are incredible inventors. So the human genome is valuable, and, sadly to say, it's kind of like maybe for raptors or reptilians in some world, maybe they like human flesh. Whatever it is, human trade or slave trade exists. So, if you have a slave trade that is being secretly conducted by these corporations, by this dark fleet associated with Nazis and NJ-12 and CIA counterintelligence and leading kind of corporations that are part of this interplanetary corporate conglomerate, you got a slave trade of millions, then billions of RFID tracking chips are going to be very handy. And I think that's what they're used for. And the Siemens Corporation is part of this group of former Nazi corporations that was used as a funnel to infiltrate the US military-industrial complex. And there's one other thing that was very interesting from Bill Pawlak's testimony, and his wife said this, his widow said this, and this was after the testimony, and she kind of was interviewed, and she said what happened was that Bill, she was talking about her husband now because he's dead, she was interviewed after his death, and after his interview went out online and publicised, so she's now being interviewed, and she said, well, Bill, he went to Tonopah test range. Tonopah, Area 51. Next to Area 51 is Tonopah test range. And she said that there was a classified program, and she said that there were all of these Air Force generals there, that Bill went in there to basically be part of a debriefing. And so he was there, these Air Force generals were there, and he said that they were waiting for this corporate official to arrive. So then, sure enough, Tonopah test range, you have a private jet landing. Someone comes out in an immaculate business suit, a very tall gentleman, and he starts talking. He has a German accent, and Pawlak says that what astonished him was that the attitude of the generals was like they were little kids. They were like so deferential to this guy, to this civilian. And he realized that the US military were really intimidated by this group of German aristocrats that were really running the show. So that was an incident that Pawlak's wife discussed. And so it's very interesting if you do a Google search on Bill Pawlak, that's spelled Pawelloc, I believe. Pawelloc, William Pawlak. Well, just go to this article, you'll see the links. In this article here, go to that, you'll see the links to Pawlak's testimony. I think that's also just another bit of the puzzle, another piece of the puzzle that, yes, the US military-industrial complex is controlled by these German elites. The Fourth Reich controls the United States. Obama, okay, we're getting pretty close to present events now. Obama signs a law protecting corporate crimes in space until 2022. This was a law that was passed last year, just before Thanksgiving. Obama signed it into law. And what's interesting about this law is that it concerns kind of the rights of corporations in space, the rights of corporations involved in space mining. And of course, adopting the CNN mindset, it's like, well, we don't have space mining projected until the mid-2020s, so why is this law relevant now? And even more significant is, why does this law give a free pass to corporations to develop labour standards and industry standards and regulations up until 2022? So that means that up until 2022, this law provides protection to any corporation involved in space programs that has conducted illicit activities or conducted crimes in space, that this law gives them protection up until 2022 under the US federal court system. Because there are no standards, there are no labour laws that apply to space. This piece of legislation says labour laws will be decided by the space industry in 2022. Until then, it's kind of like the Wild West. Well, if anything of what I've said so far is true, what that means is that everything that has happened, all of these crimes, use of nuclear weapons on Mars and who knows where else, and having forced labour in different parts of the solar system, none of that, people can't be prosecuted, because any executive can go to the US federal court system and say, well, under this particular law, there are no labour standards. Any kind of effort by an international body, such as the International Criminal Court, to prosecute people for kind of crimes in space are blocked by the US federal court system, because it's only the federal courts that will hear these cases as long as the parties recognise the jurisdiction of the US courts. So, for example, what I said about the Siemens Corporation building billions of tracking chips for the use of tracking slaves in space, just say the executives involved in building that, whenever it was, 1983 or something like that, those executives involved in that, who knowingly built these things that would be used for tracking slaves in space, under this law, they can't be prosecuted, because they could say, well, the Siemens Corporation recognises or applies or recognises US jurisdiction over our activities in space. We can't be prosecuted because there are no labour standards. Interestingly, Luxembourg, only on the 3rd of this month, proposed something similar. So not only can these corporations get protection under the US court system, but Luxembourg, as a member of the European Union, is putting together a legal and regulatory framework for space mining that will probably be modelled on the US, which again will give like a 12-year period for developing labour standards or whatever it is that they want, but kind of gives a backdoor for these crimes in space. Now, at this stage, you might think, well, this is really appalling, this is terrible that this has happened. These criminals have found a backdoor for their crimes in space. Well, it's kind of like one of those cup is half full, half empty things. It's like, yes, in a way, it's true, it gives them a back door, but also it gives them a way of relinquishing power. Remember that seminar I talked about earlier? The seminar created by the British Interplanetary Society, How to Get Rid of a Mars Colony Dictator? Well, you're not going to get rid of him by saying, you know, we're passing legislation and we're going to prosecute you and put you away for life. You know, that person's not going to resign. They're not going to give up power. But if you tell them, we're not going to prosecute, under this law that we've just passed, you have amnesty. So you can retire, you can take your billions, go to the Bahamas, build your dream villa, and live out your life in the Bahamas. You just have to give up power, that's all. Give it up. Leave the facilities in place. Don't destroy it, don't blow out the domes on Mars so that millions of people get killed on Mars. Leave. So I wouldn't be surprised if legislation like this wasn't being pushed by people to try and induce these kind of rogue entities that have really enormous power in these space colonies. So the important thing to keep in mind here is that this is not a monolithic thing. You know, this space program and these colonies and these different corporations, it's not monolithic. Sure, you have powerful actors in the center that are sending out or creating programs, sending out funding, sending out ships and so forth. But once you actually have an entity or someone in power, one of these people that manages one of these colonies, this person has great power. They have a security force. And if they feel threatened, they could simply blow up the protective dome of this colony, destroying all of the infrastructure, killing everyone there. So they can blackmail the central authorities. And actually, what was very interesting in Corey Goode's description of the Mars tour was that he said he went there under the escort of a senior executive from the interplanetary corporate conglomerate. He said that the manager of that local Mars base defied the orders of this senior executive of the interplanetary corporate conglomerate. He defied the orders. So this kind of gives you an idea of what it's like out there, that it's not monolithic, it's not really something that's going to be very easily resolved. It's very messy, it's very tricky, and that there are people trying to come up with solutions to this. So I wouldn't be surprised if this piece of legislation wasn't partly motivated by that desire. Again, glass half full, half empty. Depends on how you want to look at it. So now I'm going to look at the genesis of another space program, which was a briefing that Ronald Reagan had in 1981. So this is a briefing Reagan apparently received in 1981. And the briefing there's a document called the Reagan briefing document from 1981. Has anyone seen that document or read that document? Okay, it's associated with the Project Serpo material. But basically, this is a briefing document which described to Reagan a program to exchange military personnel with one of 5 different extraterrestrial civilizations, that was an exchange program. And of course, Close Encounters of the Third Kind was based on this hypothetical exchange program. You remember that they actually had these military astronauts that had been trained and that were prepared to be exchanged. Well, this was supposedly a real-life covert program, a real-life exchange that had happened, and Reagan had received a briefing about it in 1981. Now, people say it's disinformation, but the best disinformation is based on truth. It's just distorted, so it's a way of hiding the truth in plain sight. Because if you can put the truth out using an illegitimate source that can be easily discredited, then you've achieved your goal of basically protecting yourself from any criticism that you never told the people, because you can say, yeah, we did tell you, you just didn't believe it. It was just you put it out there, and it's a good way of kind of like protecting any project. So Reagan receives this briefing, and what I think is most credible in this is that he was told that one of these races, one of these 5 races, was extremely hostile, and that they constituted a threat to the United States and to the planet, actually to the planet itself. Reagan was convinced in 1981 that extraterrestrials were a threat, and I think that's because he was given a brief. Reagan then goes around giving speeches talking about an alien threat and why it's important for humanity to come together to respond to a possible alien threat. And he does this at meetings with the Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev. He does it as part of his kind of normal duties as president, where he's addressing audiences in different locations. And the most famous was in 1987, when he gives his speech at the United Nations, where he actually says an alien threat exists and talks about the need for humanity to come together. Now, you've got to consider that this is an American president speaking in front of the United Nations about an extraterrestrial threat. This is him telling the public, the world public, that this is real. Why did he do that? What did he tell world leaders behind the scenes? Because you can be pretty certain that what he publicly revealed was at least 1/10 of what he privately told the world leaders in confidential United Nations or State Department fora. I think what he told them was that there is an extraterrestrial threat, and we need to collaborate against that extraterrestrial threat. And the United States of America has a secret space fleet. We call it Solar Warden. And we have these space battle groups, and they are conducting surveillance and protection of our solar system. But this is a threat involving all humanity, and you all need to be involved. And so this is the plan. You can get involved. We will share our intelligence with you. We will share information on building spacecraft, and you can build these craft yourselves. But there'll be a couple of conditions. One will be that this will be entirely separate to the US Solar Warden program. And Solar Warden program is basically a program run, or was run, I think it still continues to be run. That's where we might get into questions about the whole idea of the Secret Space Program Alliance versus Solar Warden, but we can talk about that maybe during question time. But Solar Warden, as it's been run up until recently, was primarily kind of the echelon countries, the United States, Britain, Canada, Australia, and a little bit of New Zealand in there, kind of add a little bit of Kiwi flavour to the whole thing. But no other nations actually had a major role in the Solar Warden program, because Solar Warden was essentially a military program, and it wasn't going to be run. You couldn't easily fit other nations into a military-run US program. The British, the Australians, the Canadians were used to it, but other nations wouldn't be as comfortable doing that. Especially countries like Russia, China, Brazil, India, they wouldn't really kind of accept that. So the idea was come up with another space program that would be a United Nations program, kind of run by all the major nations, but it would be run outside of our solar system. And the main goal of this program would be to develop technologies for defending the planet. And I think that this was why the Cold War ended. People speculate, why did the Cold War end? And I actually edited a book, Why the Cold War Ended. There was about 20 essays in there back when I was working at the University of Queensland. People had so many theories on why the Cold War ended, but I think the reason the Cold War ended was because Reagan was able to persuade the Russians, the Warsaw Pact countries, China, India, all the others, that it was worth collaborating in putting together a United Nations-run space program where they would build their own fleets of spacecraft to do research to defend the Earth from some extraterrestrial threat. What is that extraterrestrial threat? We can speculate. I think it was probably something to do with AI, but we can talk about that maybe a little bit later. But I think that's why the Cold War ended. That was the real reason for it. And it was really a momentous time. I mean, everyone that lived through it, I mean, we were all shocked. We didn't think that this would happen. I remember I began doing my Ph.D. in 1989. By 1993, when I finished my Ph.D., the Cold War was over. In 1989, the Cold War was beginning. Everything I was writing about was predicated on that. Then it was over, and everyone was shocked. All of the professors, all of the students, no one had predicted it, because I don't think there was anything in the kind of open source literature that could predict why the Cold War ended and why scholars are still trying to answer that question. But I think in terms of the black world, that is the covert world of classified programs, the reason was because other major nations accepted the idea of cooperating with the US in sharing these advanced technologies and come up with a kind of unified planetary defense where Solar Warden would be like the first line of defense. Remember I talked about earlier, Solar Warden would create a presence and bases on 12 adjoining solar systems around our solar systems that would be patrolled by these battle fleets, these space battle fleets. That was the primary responsibility of Solar Warden. The other nations acknowledged that, but they were told that the technology that was used for Solar Warden, they would be given that, but they could use it for developing fleets that would be used for a kind of more peaceful program that would be occurring outside of Solar Warden's primary field of responsibilities to develop a solution or defense for the Earth. So that was the development of what Corey Goode describes as the Global Galactic League of Nations, and I think that really does help us understand why the Cold War ended. And here's an article that was based on one of the Cosmic Disclosure episodes that Corey Goode talks about this exomoon that he visited, where he said he did a tour. Well, he went to this base when he was working for the secret space programs, and that he saw scientists from all the major nations at this base. And they were all convinced that there was a threat humanity was facing, and that they were involved in this really important mission of developing a defense against this hostile extraterrestrial threat, or whatever it was. But all the nations were working together. So whatever it was Reagan was briefed about in 1981, it was plausible enough. And it may have been genuine. That there was a hostile extraterrestrial race. And it may not have been necessarily the draconian race that many people refer to as this kind of hostile threat, because as we know, as I've been talking about, the reptilians, the draconians, worked with the Nazis and helped them in Antarctica and helped them build the Dark Fleet and helped them infiltrate the US military-industrial complex, which they've taken over. So the draconians have been here, that they are part of this Fourth Reich. But there's another threat, something even worse than that, or at least something that all the major nations accepted. And Corey Good said that on this exomoon, all these scientists were working together in a collaborative manner. It was very different to the bases run by the interplanetary corporate conglomerate, the corporate bases using slave labor that were basically run like these slave labor camps where people were being oppressed. That this Galactic League of Nations program was something very similar to Star Trek. Again, we are a galactic culture. We are. There's a United Nations space program out there. Elites from different nations know about this. Scientists from different nations know about this. The ones that don't know are the general public and those in the security or the political system that don't have need to know. But now the information is out. It's getting out. This was a very interesting incident that I didn't talk about in the book. And I think it reveals that back in 1989, when Reagan, Gorbachev, I think Thatcher was still in power at that time, all these leaders were kind of working out how to collaborate in developing the Galactic League of Nations. Someone must have said, the obvious thing was, we can't keep this secret from the people. They need to know. And there probably was agreement. Yes, let's tell the people. We'll tell them. Let's do it. We'll move ahead. And no less than the United Nations General Secretary, Javier Perez de Cuellar, was involved in those deliberations. Stephen Greer talked about this. He gave a really wonderful 4-hour presentation. I think it was in October of 2015. I don't know the name of it. I think it's, if you just do Stephen Greer disclosure briefing 2015, you'll probably find it on Google. But it was a really good presentation. And he talked about it. And again, to get the link, probably the easiest thing is to just go to this article. It's on my website. That's the name of the article. And you'll see the link to Greer's briefing about this, where he talks about being told by Prince Hans Adam of Liechtenstein of the plan, that Prince Hans Adam was part of this plan to reveal the truth to the American public, to the world public, about a space program being set up, extraterrestrials were real. So this was planned, and that what happened was that in 1989, Perez de Cuellar was abducted. And what Greer described, I think, is pretty close to the mark, that there were those within the military-industrial complex that did not want disclosure to happen. And they abducted the Secretary General and threatened him. Threatened him and said, if you plan to go ahead with this disclosure, we're going to abduct, we're going to take all of the leaders of all the nations that agree to this, and you can't stop us. And so Perez de Cuellar and the United Nations leaders that were privy to this plan to disclose the truth abandoned the project because they had been threatened by a branch of the secret space program, one that they didn't know of. Kind of like the right hand not knowing what the left hand was doing. You had one branch of the space program, Solar Warden, wanting to move forward with this disclosure, but But another branch, the Dark Fleet, Majestic 12, Interplanetary Corporate Conglomerate, didn't want this to move forward because they knew secrecy enables them to maintain power. Maintaining power is the most important thing for them, and so secrecy is the way to do it. And so they contrived this abduction to threaten Perez de Cuellar and other world leaders to back off disclosure. So that takes us to the fifth of the special access programs, the fifth of the special secret space programs, and that concerns special access programs. And there's a quote there by Ronald Reagan, so if you just read that. So basically, Reagan is acknowledging in 1985 that the United States had the capacity to place 300 people in near-Earth orbit. So he's talking about a space program, but which space program is he talking about? I've already talked about a number, 4 so far. What I think he's talking about is something that is run by the US Air Force and the National Reconnaissance Office. It's something that, it's not in the book, it's something that I more recently got information of, but basically the US Navy set up its battle fleets to protect the solar system, to protect the perimeters of the solar system and other planets in our solar system, or at least project space power by the Navy or Solar Warden. What about the US Air Force? You know, what do they get out of this? What do they run? Well, the US Air Force and the National Reconnaissance Office, what they run is a series of cloaked spacecraft or space stations in near-Earth orbit. They've been around at least since 1985, probably since the 1970s. In the National Reconnaissance Office, its genesis is that it is an outgrowth of a failed US Air Force effort to establish manned spy satellites, or manned spacecraft in orbit of the planet, orbit around the Earth. That the Air Force, this was their plan. In the 1960s, they had something called the Manned Orbiting Laboratory. That was announced. That in the 1960s was announced by President Johnson. That that the US Air Force was building these manned space stations, and that they were training astronauts to go up in space. In 1969, Johnson announces that this program was cancelled. But it wasn't really cancelled. It was basically, they decided to move the funding off the books, basically have it become one of these special access programs, which would enable them to run it the way that they saw fit. So essentially, that was the genesis of a series of manned orbiting space stations around the Earth that use advanced cloaking technologies. And they use not so much anti-gravity craft to get up there, but they use rockets, kind of more sophisticated rockets to get up there. And that's the US Air Force, NRO. And this is a very convenient program. Because it's a program, it's a space program which in itself is highly classified. But effectively, it acts as a shield against even more highly classified programs that I've been talking about tonight, this afternoon. Solar Warden, the Interplanetary Corporate Conglomerate, the Galactic League of Nations. These are more advanced space programs that use much more advanced technologies. But the way in which the US national security system operates is that you hide your deepest secrets with other secrets, which are hidden by other less classified secrets. So it's almost like a hierarchy of secrets. So that way, if any congressman were to kind of listen to any of this kind of information and take it seriously, they can be given a briefing on the NRO US Air Force program and then basically told, this is the real secret space program. All the other stuff, you know, these guys, Corey Good and Tompkins, they're our paid disinfo guys. They're just putting out disinfo. This is the real info. And you've been briefed. So you're not to tell anyone the truth, or we'll get your family, you know, it's something like that. So this is the way they hide the secret. They basically use less classified secrets. And it's interesting that the Snowden documents show this, illustrate this, that here you have, these are the most secret programs. They're called exceptionally compartmented information, right? The NSA, National Security Agency, these are the most classified programs, or special access programs. You could call them unacknowledged special access programs, but for the NSA they're called exceptionally compartmented information, ECI. So these are hidden under Sentry Eagle, which are other classified programs. So this would be something like, in terms of what I've been discussing, you would have like the US Air Force, NRO up here, and down here you have like Solar Warden, Interplanetary Corporate Conglomerate, Galactic League of Nations. I think you get the picture. And that's how you hide it. That's how you hide the secret space programs. And so here's an illustration of how the US Air Force was displaying its kind of cutting-edge technology. This XR-37 kind of miniature space shuttle that was going up to the service space shuttles up there, but it would be in space for like, I think the record is close to 2 years. It's like, well, what in the world are they doing up there for nearly 2 years? What could possibly be happening up there? Well, they're involved with these space stations that are up there. And this is a cover program. This is not the real space program, but they want people to believe that it's the space program. And this is one of the things Corey Good says and emphasizes, which I think is very valid, that he says that people involved in these programs, the US Air Force guys and the NRO guys, or the guys at Area 51 that have been working on these programs, if you go in there and you talk about the Solar Warden and all that, they'll beat you up because they'll be convinced that you've accepted this information. Because they really believe this is the real stuff. This is the real space program. But it's not. But it's a very clever cover program. And you have people emotionally invested in this because they've gone through a career of being given access to sensitive information, classified information, so that their mindset is locked in that there cannot possibly be anything more secret than this, because if there was, I would know. I got level 33 crypto clearance. I would know, This Solar Warden stuff can't be happening. Corey Good is a fraud, couldn't possibly be happening. They're emotionally invested in it. And then rogue aspects, the right hand not knowing what the left hand is doing. 9/11 being an inside job. I don't know how many people here buy into that, but I know that there are a lot of very credible researchers that say that 9/11 was an inside job, and that one in particular, Judy Woods, wrote a book and did research, and basically she showed, and here's an illustration of like one of the towers, the spire on one of the twin towers, how it becomes dustified. You can see it here, looking very solid. Here it is, still solid. Here it's starting to fade. Here, look, it's disappearing. It's like Well, and you think about it, well, if the trade trail collapsed because of fire in whatever floor it was, that wouldn't affect the spire. Or the antenna, they would just fall. They would fall in their entirety to the bottom, and you'd see them at the bottom. What she said was that they were dustified. There wasn't anything left of them, which proves in her mind that space weapons were used. Space weapons, okay? What space weapons? Okay, well, NRO has cloaked space stations up there with advanced technologies. Were they using one of these technologies, kind of directed energy weapons? I think they were. Whether it was from one of the NRO space stations or whether from some other dark program, but certainly I think that one of the special access programs were involved in this 9/11 scenario. So that involves the 5 secret space programs that Corey Goode identified as existing and that him having some level of direct knowledge of. And of course, a lot of his testimony is supported by other people like Bill Tompkins, who talked about several of these programs, the Nazi program, the Dark Fleet, the Interplanetary Conglomerate that Tompkins was also talking about, the corporations being infiltrated. And I've run over some whistleblowers saying, okay, these 5 space programs exist. So now we get into some ancient secret space programs. That it's not just a matter of some secret societies in Germany establishing telepathic communications with off-world beings or beings from the inner earth. And the inner earth is important, and I will be getting into that in more depth as we go on. That it actually predates that, well beyond that. And of course, this is from the Temple of Abydos in Egypt, very famous. I'm sure you've seen it. Very clear evidence that the ancients were familiar with advanced aerospace technologies. Here you have a very famous carving on a sarcophagus found in somewhere there in the Mayan areas, showing Lord Pakal, one of the kind of Mayan gods, in what appears to be a rocket-propelled device. So again, the Mayan civilization involved in some kind of space program. And I think it's very important to note that the Mayans achieved something in their history that was very special. I've mentioned that in 2010, on a Coast to Coast AM interview, I mentioned that in 2010 I was approached by someone who belonged to what he described at the time as a Mayan as a Mayan space civilization. That's what he described it as. He said that the Mayans had achieved space travel, and that they actually were part of a civilization in space that continued to use the Mayan language and that wanted to know if I was interested in joining, in being a part of that. For reasons I can maybe answer in questions, I decided not to join, but that was my first exposure to the idea of a secret space program that involved the Mayan civilization. But that was in 2010. I didn't talk about it publicly because that was the only time I'd ever come across that kind of information. But when Corey Goode began talking about a Mayan secret space program, that really got my attention. Here are some artifacts that are more recent that show what appear to be spacecraft and aliens in the ancient Mayan civilization, or from that era. So what do these Mayans look like, or what are they like? Well, Corey Goode kind of gave a humorous kind of graphic of what they look like. They look like that. Willy Wonka. Willy Wonka. I mean, he was trying to describe what they look like, and he said that they're very friendly, very jovial, very short, kind of like have that Mayan look, and he said they're a very spiritual race, very supportive of humanity, and significantly, they were helping humans that were being secretly abducted into the slave trade. And that the secret space program, especially when Solar Warden turned against the Dark Fleet and interplanetary corporate conglomerate, that there was that kind of break between them, that the Mayan civilization would help many of these people that had been abducted and kind of used in these as forced labor in these space programs. They would relocate them to some Mayan world, some Mayan home world, some place in another solar system where they could be accommodated until such time as conditions on Earth would facilitate their return, because they had been very heavily traumatized. If they came back with these kinds of stories, no one would believe them, and that would be kind of more of a problem for them. So that takes me to the next part, and what I think would be good is if I pause now